April 1944. The world was already burning. From the gray waters of the Baltic to the crushed streets of Berlin, the once unstoppable Reich was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Allied bombers owned the skies, the Red Army thundered from the east, and the Atlantic, once a German hunting ground, had become a graveyard of steel coffins. Yet even as the Reich crumbled, one final desperate order left the war rooms of Berlin: continue the monsoon missions, maintain the Axis link with the Empire of Japan. For the men of U-862, that meant one thing: a journey no submarine had ever attempted before. A voyage across 3 oceans, beyond the reach of German command, to a far-off ally whose empire was also cracking beneath American fire. Their captain, Heinrich Timm, was only 30 years old, but already a legend in the U-boat arm, precise, ruthless, and unnervingly calm under pressure. He knew this wasn't a mission for glory. It was a mission for ghosts. The war had turned against them. Every day, Allied convoys grew stronger, armed with radar, depth charges, and aircraft that could spot a periscope from miles away. The Atlantic had swallowed over 700 German U-boats. Still, Timm's crew volunteered. They were promised Japan, exotic ports, safety, maybe even a chance to survive. But in the heart of every sailor, a darker truth lingered. Once they left Europe, there would be no return. U-862 was a Type Winder D2 long-range submarine, one of the largest ever built by Germany. It could sail over 23,000 kilometers without refueling, a floating spear designed for faraway hunts. In the shipyards of Kiel, mechanics worked under air raid sirens to get her ready. Torpedoes were loaded, diesel drums secured, and every inch of space was filled with spare parts, food, and bottled air. The men carried letters they'd never get to send, photographs tucked in uniform pockets, and quiet dread behind forced smiles. For months, German high command had coordinated with Japan through secret radio codes. Both nations needed each other. Germany was losing in Europe, Japan in the Pacific. Together, they hoped to share technology, radar, engines, fuel additives, anything that could buy them time. To the Allied world, it sounded insane. A German submarine trying to reach Japan in 1944, when Allied ships ruled the seas. To the crew of U-862, it sounded like fate. In early May 1944, under a moonless night, U-862 slipped away from the Norwegian coast. No fanfare, no goodbyes. Just the soft hum of diesel engines pushing into the North Atlantic. Above them, searchlights from Allied patrol planes cut across the clouds like divine swords. Inside the submarine, air was already thick with oil and sweat. The crew, 59 men, moved in silence, every clang of metal echoing like a heartbeat. For the next several months, this narrow steel tube would be their home, their prison, and possibly their tomb. They knew the odds. By then, the average life expectancy of a U-boat sailor was barely 3 patrols. The ocean didn't forgive mistakes, and the Allies had learned every trick in the book. Still, Captain Timm's voice remained steady. "We sail east, to Japan." The men didn't cheer. They just nodded. By mid-1944, the Atlantic was crawling with Allied destroyers and aircraft. The wolf packs that once terrorized convoys were now hunted like sharks by packs of their own prey. German submarines were forced to dive deeper, stay under longer, and surface only at night to recharge batteries. Each time U-862 broke the surface, the crew could smell the salt, the fear, and the smoke from distant battles. Radio operators occasionally caught fragments of broadcasts. D-Day had begun. The Allies were landing in France. Germany was dying faster than anyone dared admit. But the mission continued. Berlin's orders were clear: reach the East Indies, link with Japan, and harass Allied shipping in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It was both a supply run and a symbolic gesture, proof that the Axis alliance still breathed. As U-862 crossed the equator, the men celebrated by dumping buckets of warm seawater over new crew members, a tradition older than the war itself. Laughter echoed through the steel corridors for a brief moment, before fading back into the drone of the engines. The further they went, the more surreal the war felt. Gone were the icy gray waves of the North Atlantic. Now the water turned deep blue, the skies brighter, and the danger less predictable. They encountered neutral ships, fishing vessels, even merchant steamers unaware that a German submarine stalked beneath them. Timm avoided unnecessary attacks. Fuel and torpedoes were precious. Every shot fired was a risk of exposure. By late 1944, after months at sea, U-862 reached the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. This was one of the most dangerous choke points in the world, patrolled constantly by British and South African air squadrons. The crew ran silent, engines off, gliding with currents, sonar pings echoing like distant bells. At one point, a British Catalina bomber flew overhead, so close that the shadow passed over the periscope lens. The crew froze, hands trembling over the depth charge switches. But fate, for once, was kind. The bomber turned away. U-862 lived to dive another day. Weeks blurred into months. Inside the boat, humidity climbed above 90%. Mold crept into the bunks, diesel fumes poisoned the air, and tempers began to break. Men started hallucinating, hearing phantom propellers, whispering voices, distant explosions that weren't there. Sleep came in short, sweaty bursts. Food was rationed, water stank of rust, and every vibration made hearts stop. But through it all, Captain Timm kept them disciplined. He ordered daily drills, navigation updates, and even small chess tournaments to keep minds sharp. His leadership wasn't loud, it was steady. In war, that's rarer than heroism. By December 1944, U-862 had done the impossible. She had crossed the Atlantic, slipped past Africa, and entered the Indian Ocean, territory dominated by the Japanese Navy. They'd lost no men, no major equipment, and had avoided detection for nearly 7 months. When a Japanese radio signal finally crackled through the static, "Penang awaits." The crew erupted in exhausted cheers. They had reached the other side of the world. But the real war was just beginning. January 1945. The world was collapsing, but the sea remained silent. The men of U-862 had sailed for nearly 8 months, farther than any other German submarine in history. Behind them lay Europe's ashes. Ahead, the endless blue of the Indian Ocean, hotter, deeper, and more unpredictable than any water they'd crossed before. They were no longer the hunters of the Atlantic. They were phantoms, forgotten soldiers of a dying Reich, moving through enemy seas on a mission that no longer had a nation behind it. The first time they surfaced off Sumatra, the sunrise hit them like a hallucination. The air was heavy with salt and jungle humidity. Palm-covered coasts replaced the gray cliffs of Norway. The sea shimmered gold, deceptively calm, until Allied aircraft appeared like black dots on the horizon. Here the war moved differently. There were no convoys, no massive fleets. Just isolated merchant ships, civilian transports, and Allied patrol planes sweeping the sky like hawks. Captain Heinrich Timm adjusted his strategy. They'd strike only when safe, conserve fuel, and keep moving toward Penang, a Japanese-occupied port that now served as the headquarters for Germany's Monsun-Gruppe, a scattered handful of submarines trying to connect east and west. For the crew, the thought of land, real land, felt almost mythical. Some hadn't seen sunlight in months. When U-862 finally reached Penang, it felt like stepping onto another planet. Japanese officers greeted the Germans with stiff courtesy. Their uniforms were crisp, their bows deep, but their eyes betrayed exhaustion. Japan was already crumbling under the American advance, and the alliance between the two empires was less about friendship and more about survival instinct. The Japanese provided fuel, food, and fresh torpedoes. In return, the Germans shared their U-boat technology, radar detectors, encrypted communication devices, and tactics honed from years of Atlantic warfare. For a brief, surreal moment, German sailors drank sake with Japanese officers, toasting a victory that neither side believed in anymore. In the humid docks of Penang, the air reeked of diesel and irony. Within weeks, U-862 set sail again, this time under Japanese operational command. Their new patrol route, the Bay of Bengal, the South China Sea, and eventually the coast of Australia. Their orders were simple: disrupt Allied shipping, create chaos, remind them the Axis still fights. The submarine turned west, moving like a ghost through the dark currents. It was during one of these missions that U-862 achieved what no other German U-boat ever had. It became the only one to operate in the Pacific Ocean. The ocean around them was vast, silent, and merciless. The heat was unbearable. Temperatures inside the hull reached 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat dripped from the ceiling like rain. Men stripped down to their undershirts, rationing water like gold. Every day was the same routine: dive, hide, listen, and wait. They heard Allied aircraft engines long before they saw them. Each time the sonar ping echoed through the steel, hearts froze. Then came their chance. Late December 1944, just off the coast of Sydney, Australia. At dawn, through the periscope lens, Captain Timm spotted a merchant ship, the Robert J. Walker, an Allied cargo vessel heading north. The sea was calm, windless, and blue as polished glass. Perfect for killing. At 6:30, he gave the order: Feuer frei. 2 torpedoes shot out, cutting silver trails beneath the waves. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a thunderclap. The explosion shattered the silence. Flames erupted from the ship's side, smoke coiling into the bright Australian sky. The vessel began to list, sirens wailing, men scrambling on deck. The Germans watched through the periscope, stone-faced. It wasn't pride anymore. It was duty. The logic of war had burned out of them long ago. They didn't celebrate the sinking. They just marked the coordinates, turned south, and slipped back into the deep. When the news reached Australia that a German U-boat had attacked their shores, panic rippled through the coastal defenses. The idea that Hitler's navy had reached the Pacific seemed impossible, almost mythic. Newspapers called it the ghost from Europe. Anti-submarine patrols increased. American and Australian bombers scoured the coastline. Depth charges rained into the sea like thunder. But U-862 had already moved on, heading north toward New Zealand, striking again near the coast of Napier. Each attack was brief, surgical, and vanishing. By the time radar picked up anything, they were gone. The submarine had become a rumor, a whisper in the static. But the victories meant nothing. Every time U-862 surfaced, the radio brought worse news. Germany collapsing, Berlin under siege, Japan losing island after island. The Reich they fought for was dissolving while they drifted thousands of miles away, forgotten. Captain Timm began to change. He stopped reading Hitler's transmissions. He stopped saluting the radio. His focus narrowed to one goal: keeping his men alive long enough to see the war's end. Fuel was low, food was scarce, the air smelled of oil and rot. Still, he refused to surrender to despair. He told the crew, "We started this voyage under one flag. We'll finish it under no one's." The men didn't know whether that was courage or quiet rebellion. Maybe both. By early 1945, Allied air supremacy was absolute. British reconnaissance aircraft roamed the Indian Ocean like vultures. They hunted anything that moved. U-862 was nearly caught several times, once by a British Sunderland patrol bomber that dropped depth charges within 50 meters. The shock waves slammed through the hull, bursting pipes, flooding compartments. For 5 hours, the crew fought to stay alive in total darkness, waist-deep in freezing water. They surfaced at night, engines coughing smoke, only to dive again at the first glimmer of moonlight. Each survival felt less like luck and more like borrowed time. Thousands of miles away, the world they knew was ending. They hadn't seen a German port in a year. Their families believed them dead. The submarine was now a drifting island of ghosts, sustained by routine, haunted by memory. In the mess hall, conversations turned strange. Some men talked about settling in Japan after the war, joining the Imperial Navy, even marrying locals. Others fantasized about surrendering to the British and finally breathing real air again. One sailor carved the words, "Wir sind die Letzten." We are the last ones, into the steel wall near the torpedo room. He wasn't wrong. By March 1945, fuel reserves were dangerously low. They radioed the Japanese base at Kobe, requesting permission to dock for refueling and repairs. The response came hours later, faint but clear through the static. "Proceed north. You are expected." The Japanese Navy dispatched reconnaissance planes to provide cover. For the first time, German and Japanese aircraft coordinated over the Pacific, guiding U-862 through hostile waters. It was a haunting image. Axis allies, both doomed, still fighting to maintain the illusion of victory. The submarine slipped past the Philippine coast under Japanese protection. From above, Zero fighters circled like guardian angels. From below, sonar pings whispered reminders of the enemies waiting in the dark. By mid-1945, the order from Berlin arrived. Cease offensive operations, conserve resources, await further instruction. But there would be no further instruction. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The Reich was gone. U-862 received the news while floating somewhere near Singapore, surrounded by miles of empty ocean. No one spoke for a long time. Then Captain Timm simply said, "We continue to Japan." He turned off the radio. When they reached Japan, the once glorious imperial ports were half ruined by American air raids. Smoke lingered in the distance. Factories were silent. Civilians watched the German sailors arrive with a mix of confusion and pity. The Japanese Navy welcomed them as comrades. But beneath the formality, everyone knew the war was finished. Still, the Germans helped repair U-boats, train crews, and document technology, clinging to purpose in a world already lost. In that summer of 1945, both nations existed in denial. One defeated, the other waiting to be. And then, the sky over Hiroshima burned. August 1945. The sea was calm, but the world had ended. When the crew of U-862 surfaced in Japanese waters, they expected celebration, maybe even relief. Instead, they found silence, the kind of silence that follows a funeral. Smoke rose from distant cities. The Japanese officers who greeted them no longer saluted with pride. Their eyes were hollow, uniforms wrinkled, voices subdued. The Germans asked what had happened. The interpreter hesitated, then said one word: "Hiroshima." No one on board understood what that truly meant. "An entire city destroyed by one bomb," they repeated in disbelief. But the truth arrived with the next radio message. Nagasaki had vanished too. The Americans had unleashed a weapon the world had never seen, and Japan's emperor had decided to surrender. The men of U-862 stared at each other in silence. They'd crossed 3 oceans, survived the Atlantic, the Indian, and the Pacific, only to arrive in a world where their war no longer existed. Captain Heinrich Timm gathered his officers in the cramped control room. The diesel engines hummed like a heartbeat in the background. He spoke softly. "We will wait for official orders. Until then, we remain soldiers." But even he didn't believe that anymore. Within days, Japanese naval officers boarded U-862 carrying documents stamped with imperial seals. They politely demanded all weapons to be disabled, torpedoes removed, radios surrendered. For the first time since the war began, Captain Timm gave an order that felt like betrayal. He told his men to open the torpedo hatches, empty them one by one into the sea. The weapons slipped away into the dark, vanishing like the Reich itself. Some men cried, others watched blankly. Years of discipline and pride dissolved into a dull acceptance. The iron boat that had once carried the fury of Europe was now just another powerless hull in enemy waters. August 15th, 1945. The Emperor's voice came over the radio, thin, trembling, almost ghostly. He announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The Japanese officers stood motionless, listening. The Germans didn't understand the language, but they felt the weight of it. When the transmission ended, nobody moved. Then a Japanese commander turned to Captain Timm and simply said, "The war is over." Timm nodded, though he didn't know what that meant for men like them, foreigners without a country, stranded on the far side of the world. Allied forces moved fast. Within weeks, British and Australian troops landed in ports across Japan. Every Axis vessel was ordered to surrender immediately. U-862 was seized near Singapore, her crew lined up on deck under the blazing sun. The British soldiers who boarded looked at them like curiosities. Pale, thin Europeans in tattered Kriegsmarine uniforms, speaking broken English, and even some Japanese. Their weapons were confiscated, insignias removed. For the first time, they weren't the hunters of the sea. They were prisoners of war. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The British towed U-862 into Fremantle, Australia, under heavy guard. It was the same coastline they had once attacked. Now they arrived not as invaders, but as captives. Civilians gathered at the docks to see the infamous submarine. Newspapers called it Hitler's last ghost. Inside the camp, the Germans were questioned for weeks. How did you get here? Who gave the orders? Why were you still fighting? Most had no answers. They'd spent so long following orders that by the end they didn't know whose orders they were following anymore. Some were eventually transferred to POW camps inland. Murchison, Cowra, Loveday, isolated patches of red Australian soil surrounded by barbed wire. They spent months behind fences, building wooden furniture, fixing engines, watching kangaroos through the wire. Prison life wasn't brutal, just empty. The men slept in hot barracks, wrote letters that never reached Germany, and stared at maps of a world that had moved on without them. They heard rumors. Hitler dead, Berlin divided, their families scattered across ruins. One sailor received a letter months later saying his wife had remarried, assuming he was lost at sea. He tore it quietly and never spoke again. Captain Timm kept a small notebook. Each day he wrote a few lines, dates, weather, short reflections. No orders, no nation, only time. He became almost fatherly to his crew, mediating disputes, encouraging discipline even in captivity. If leadership is measured not by victory, but by endurance, Timm had earned it. The Allies debated what to do with U-862. Some argued it should be scrapped. Others wanted to study it. In 1946, the British Navy took possession and briefly commissioned it as HMS Autumn, using it for training before finally scuttling it off the coast of Hong Kong. It sank quietly, swallowed by the same ocean that had carried it halfway around the planet. No ceremony, no memorial, just bubbles rising into the blue. When the war crime trials ended and Europe stabilized, the surviving crewmen were repatriated, if you could call it that. They returned not to the Germany they left, but to a divided land split between East and West, occupied by the same Allies who had once hunted them. Some joined civilian shipping lines. A few emigrated to South America. Most just faded into anonymity, ex-soldiers with too many memories and nowhere to put them. Captain Timm lived quietly, rarely speaking of the voyage. When asked years later if he regretted taking the mission, he replied, "No. A sailor does not regret the sea, only the orders that send him there." U-862 remains one of the strangest war stories ever told, a single vessel that linked two collapsing empires, crossing 3 oceans, while both its nations crumbled. It was part of no victory and ended in no glory, yet its journey symbolized everything about the final year of World War II. Stubborn loyalty, desperate faith, and the slow realization that the world had changed forever. In the grand histories, U-862 is barely a footnote, but to the men who breathed its recycled air and watched its steel walls sweat under the pressure of 1,000 meters, it was an entire lifetime, a self-contained universe of oil, fear, duty, and fading hope. Imagine it now, a steel coffin drifting through black water. 50 men who had lost their home, their war, and their reason, still keeping watch, still charting the stars, as if refusing to admit the ocean was all that remained. They were the last ghosts of an alliance born in madness, bound together by pride, torn apart by time. Their story began as a mission of glory. It ended as a whisper in the tides. And somewhere, miles beneath the surface, U-862 still sleeps, the German submarine that sailed to Japan and vanished into history.